Like, some people are motivated by negative reinforcement, some are motivated by positive reinforcement. I'm not personally motivated by anything. Hello everybody, welcome to Awesome Rusty Bucket. Subscribe to the channel if you're over on YouTube and give us a like. It helps the video do better in the algorithm, so it's much appreciated. Also check this out as an audio-only experience over on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Real quick, just at the top, I want to mention two things. One, I have a red spot on my head for some reason. I don't know what's going on with that, but it looks weird. There's a little bit on the other side too. Secondly, most importantly, I would appreciate it if you guys would make your takes a little shorter, or at least try to consider that, because A, I don't really want to read out a super long thing, but also B, there's not a lot of these that I can fit into a YouTube title, so the shorter your take is, the more likely it is to be reacted to. I'm not saying you can't leave a little explanation, that's all entirely fine, but say the take forthright with a sentence and then maybe another sentence explaining it, but no more than that. I really appreciate, obviously you guys are providing content to begin with. I scrolled the whole comment section for a title and found one, so hopefully it does well. But anyways, let's go ahead and get into these takes. People that only watch sports massively underrate fatigue as a deciding factor. It is not often discussed how weaker conferences at various points in history have massively affected finals matchups. When one conference is a war and a team gets taken to 7 in their conference finals especially, their chances of winning the finals immediately drops. Some examples being the 1987 Celtics, the 1994 Knicks, 98 Bulls, even if they won, the 2006 Mavs, and the 2016 Warriors. Well, a really good example to me that I made me actually really consider this aspect of the game, I believe it was Jason Tatum who said this, but it was someone on the Celtics. There was the OG Anunoby game winner, I think it was game 4, where Kyle Lowry threw a skip pass across the court for a corner 3. That won them the game, and it, I think, tied the series, if I'm remembering that correctly, and it otherwise would have been a 3-1 lead, and otherwise would have probably been over in 5 games, but then they had to play out the rest of the series. I don't know if it went 6 or 7. That is definitely a factor. That the fact that his take, obviously there's bias in this, but it was that they didn't end up making the finals or winning the finals because they let that game winner go in and then thus had to play a much longer series. So part of that can actually end up being on the team for just not taking care of business when they should have. You could argue the 2016 Warriors shouldn't have gone down 3-1 to the OKC Thunder and the series could have been much quicker. But of course, we also recognize that conferences are rarely balanced. There's been times where the East was actually the more difficult conference than the West, but more often than not, the West is the more difficult conference. And I feel like one that I can especially think of is Kobe and Shaq. They got cupcake finals matchups because the Eastern Conference sucked. Now, they had to battle through a difficult Western Conference to get there. By the time they actually made the finals, it was pretty much a foregone conclusion. They played the Sixers, who had AI and Mutombo, but really little else besides, but I think they had the 6th man of the year as well. Then they played the Indiana Pacers before that. The Indiana Pacers really didn't have much of a shot, even with Kobe not quite being superstar level at that point. And the Nets, they also really didn't have much of a shot. So this factors in a lot, especially as it relates to the playoffs. So I just agree. I just spent 3 minutes telling you that I agree. And that take was from Vectuscraft. From Monbo. Hot take, with how basketball is played today, point of attack defense is significantly more important and impactful to winning than traditional rim protection. Being able to navigate a pick and roll and effectively defend the perimeter is a more versatile and useful skill set. The value of players with these defensive skills like Derek White, Jalen Suggs, and Amen Thompson is grossly underrated by a lot of fans, though I think front offices are starting to come around. I get where you're coming from. If I'm going to pull from an example, I would argue the Chicago Bulls, when Lonzo Ball and Alex Caruso were both healthy, was a great example of this, because the Bulls were a top 5 defense in spite of the fact that the other 3 players on the floor was Zach LaVine, DeMar DeRozan, and Nikola Vucevic. Now, I will argue that Vucevic is a better defender than a lot of people give him credit for. Worse offensive player than some give him credit for, especially Stacey King, who apparently thinks he's Shaq if you give him post possessions. But I'm going to disagree, because truly the best thing that perimeter defenders are capable of doing is preventing a shot at the basket or contesting a shot well at the basket. Obviously, you need to contest jump shots and all of that well. Obviously, you need to make sure the offense feels you, whether it's navigating a pick and roll or whatever. A shot at the rim is the most valuable one. Spacing has made the opportunity to get to the rim easier, made the jobs of perimeter defenders harder, but that also makes the job of the center harder. The center needs the perimeter defenders to hold back the perimeter players from just getting to the rim at will. But the perimeter player, who they're going to make mistakes every once in a while. You're probably not going to have a rock solid defensive perimeter core unless you're the Celtics, but you're probably going to make some mistakes. And at that point, if you don't have a good rim protector, you're giving up easy points. The rim protection is still the most important. I think the balance is very different from what it used to be. I don't think perimeter defense was nearly as important as it is today, and that's just because the job's gotten harder. Like covering the amount of space, you have to cover basically double the amount of space that used to need to be covered in the NBA. So for that reason, I think it's harder to do, and thus it's more valuable when you find someone that can do it. So I disagree, but I see where you're coming from. From Bam Adebayo is really underrated and is a top 15 player in the league right now. He's being overshadowed by Butler's expected performance in the playoffs and by being on the Heat. I don't think I would say Bam is top 15, but he's probably top 20, and I've kind of come around to the idea that he might be the best player on the Miami Heat. Jimmy still has that factor of like, maybe he'll just turn into Michael Jordan. Until he never does that again, I'm just going to fear that there's the possibility that exists. But Bam is maybe the best defender in the NBA. And then offensively speaking, he has his limitations, but he's a decent mid-range scorer. He's a great lob target. I wish that Miami used him as a lob target a little bit more. Low-key can dribble the ball a little bit, and he's a good passer. Miami has moved away from using him as a playmaking hub, which I mostly think is a mistake. I kind of want Jimmy to go somewhere else, just because I'd be interested to see what a Bam Adebayo-led team would look like. You would need to get some sort of perimeter creator to pair with him, ideally one who is a better passer, not that Jimmy's a bad passer by any stretch, he's a really good one, or a better three-point shooter, which Jimmy definitely isn't. It would just be interesting. I would like to see that. I actually think in 2K I've done that before, where I've traded Jimmy and then player locked on Bam just to see what that would be like. He's essentially like a B+ Kevin Garnett, and maybe in the right context he could be closer to an A Kevin Garnett, you know, maybe a B- on his bad nights, but when he's at his best, B+. From Tom Mulan, I think Dr. J is a top 8 greatest player of all time, because if you include his ABA accolades and stats, he becomes a 3-time champ, 2 times finals MVP, 4 times MVP, 8-time 8th in all-time scoring, 3-time scoring champ, 16-time All-Star, 12 times All-NBA, and career averages of 24, 4, and 9, as well as some crazy prime playoff numbers. But overall, I do think that the NBA should acknowledge ABA stats and accolades, because guys like Dr. J spent most of their primes in the ABA, so it makes their stats in the NBA when they were older seem like they're not as good as they were. My all-time list, and this is where I got a lot of confusion on the Kareem take, because a lot of people were bringing up college and high school. When I'm doing an all-time list, I'm doing an all-time NBA player list. What did you do while playing for the National Basketball Association? And I do not think that the ABA stats should be factored in to that. I recognize it's kind of bad, and also this is an argument why I think the 70s is kind of a weak era, especially in the superstar department, because guys like Julius Erving, George Gervin, Artis Gilmore, there are probably other examples, were playing in the ABA when they should have been playing in the NBA. That would have been more ideal, and the talent pool would have been more collectivized. So I think it takes away from the 70s in a way for the NBA, but I don't know. I'm just not going to recognize ABA stuff as though it's on the same footing, because from what I understand, while the ABA did have a lot of superstar talents, it wasn't as talented as the NBA was, and I already feel as though that was a weaker NBA. So I'm definitely not going to put him in the top 8 because of it. If you want to factor that in, you're allowed to. I'm just under the label of the NBA, what did you do? It's as simple as possible if I keep it to just that, so that's what I tend to do, but it's fine. I get where you're coming from. And yeah, if you look at his ABA stuff, Dr. J was doing some wild shit. From Silent K, the league's refusal to expand since 04 has oversaturated the talent pool, making superstars matter less and dynasties less feasible. Basically, it's a, and not the, root cause of a lot of the ideas Rusty has been talking about. Basketball being a constantly evolving sport means that players are constantly getting more talented, requiring more dilution than the other big 4 leagues, aka more teams. Yeah, I get where you're coming from, and I think that is helpful. I do wonder where that ends. Like, obviously, you can add 2 more teams. I don't think adding 2 more teams is going to hurt the balance of the league too much. It'll probably balance it out, if anything else. But, like, do we want to get to a point where we have 40, even 50 NBA teams? Do we want to decrease the odds of your franchise being the one that gets it, because now it's the 1 out of 30 franchises, it's 1 out of 50, 1 out of 40? I do think it's potentially a slippery slope where you will, this will have to be adapted over time, so it's not like this is just happening overnight. But as you're saying here, the talent will continue to progress, so then it will need to be diluted again. If I would compare it, dumb comparison, but it's what popped into my head. The dumbass logic of Thanos. Like, oh, I'm gonna snap half of the universe away. How long before that half has been made up for in the population? Pretty soon thereafter. Like, couple hundred years maybe? If you're looking for a lasting solution, you're just going to have to keep refreshing the page here, and I feel like that could eventually get to a point where it's out of hand. From Michael McPhee, regional NBA broadcast teams should unashamedly be biased, but should also have one Jesse Ventura-style heel commentator saying infuriating and obviously not true things about the team. Yes, it might make the players mad, but it would be hilarious to see some guy on the Golden State Warriors broadcast team saying Cam Johnson is a more reliable floor spacer than Steph Curry. I would watch that all day, every day. I get where you're coming from. I don't think that should be the main broadcast. I do feel like, I don't know how financially viable this would be or how actually achievable it really is, but I think it would be sick if there were multiple different broadcasts with like intentionally different tone, like a professional broadcast team, and then like dudes who are just fucking around, and then like maybe something that's in the middle of the pack of that. I feel like the middle of the pack of that is what most broadcast teams are going for. I will say though, it does enrage me when Stacey King says the shit that he does about the Chicago Bulls. So that is something that happens already. I don't think it's as ludicrous as Cam Johnson spaces the floor better than Steph. A lot of commentators are saying dumb shit already that is infuriating their fan bases already. From Curb Stomp, defense is alive and well in the modern NBA. Everyone likes to talk about how the offense wins every interaction now, but if we look at the landscape of the NBA, it's defensive teams that are dominating the top spots. Is there stuff we can change to make it better? Absolutely, but modern offense is more a product of spacing than physicality, and we're seeing now that you can't win with a team that's focused on defending that space. It took a few years for the league to adapt. It just took them a few years to adapt. Yeah, that's 100% true. I would actually argue that the 2024 Celtics, with everybody healthy, is one of the greatest defensive teams that has ever played this game. I believe they were first in defensive rating this year, and they were almost certainly that for the playoffs. The fact that they have a good defender at every position and off of the bench They have a decent defender at this point in Al Horford, probably still good. He's just old and not as fast as he used to be. Sam Hauser is not a liability, really. Starting lineup-wise, Drew Holiday, Derek White, Jaylen Brown, not as much. Probably the weakest defender of the group, but still a damn good defender. Jason Tatum, Kristaps Porzingis. What the fuck? That's a crazy stacked defense. And yeah, pretty much throughout the league's history, if you're winning a championship, you probably had a top 5 defense in the NBA, at the bare minimum top 10. I only think a couple of times teams didn't have a top 10 offense or top 10 defense in the NBA when they won. But in some cases, they turned the defense up when the playoffs came around. Like, I think, let me check this up real quick. 2018 Warriors were 11th in defense, but I'll bet you if you look at the playoffs, that goes up. Yeah, they were fucking number 1. They had the best defense of the entire playoffs. So if you go back and look at champions year by year, you are going to get a good defense. Let's just do that. Celtics last year, 3rd in defensive rating. Denver Nuggets, 15th in defensive rating. I didn't realize it was that low. It's probably the reason why I didn't pick them to win going into it. But let's look at the advanced. I'm willing to bet 3rd best of the entire playoffs. Golden State in 2022. Best defense in the entire league. Milwaukee Bucks in 2021, 10th best defense. I would have guessed better than that, but hey, it's still top 10. Lakers, 3rd in defensive rating. The Toronto Raptors, 5th in defensive rating. The 2018 Warriors, as we previously looked at, 11th. 2nd in defense in 2017. 10th in defense for the Cavs in 2016. 1st in defense for the Warriors in 2015. And I'm going to consider that the start of like the more modern era. So yeah, they're always great defenses. Okay, you need a good defense to win a championship. Even still, people are not recognizing that the reason defense feels less prominent is because offense changed, not because defenders just stopped trying. That is a caveman take. That is a, oh shit, the sun god doesn't like us, that's why it went down today. Like, get a grip, okay? That is just not the reality. You are not paying attention, you are not watching, and you're just being a fucking boomer, to be honest. I think some of the greatest defensive players of all time are playing right now because this is one of the hardest eras to have a good defense in. From Fruit Lopes, winning mentality does not mean you have to be an asshole to everyone. Talking trash all game or punching your teammates in the face is not good leadership that leads to wins. If Kobe was nicer, he'd be an 8-time champion. I don't know about that. It's an interesting thing to me, that whole ordeal. Because, like, there is an argument to be made that it can lead to more success, but it also kind of depends on the person. Like, some people are motivated by negative reinforcement, some are motivated by positive reinforcement. I'm not personally motivated by anything, but, you know, that's just multiple mental illnesses. But in general, I agree that it's probably not that helpful to be super belligerent. I really don't think it's super helpful to talk shit about your teammates and talk them down. Like, as an example, was Michael Jordan just destroying the brain of a 20-year-old Kwame Brown like a positive thing for that team? Like, we only hear about the success stories more often than not, but I guarantee you there are plenty of ones where dudes just didn't end up getting along, they couldn't see eye to eye, and people didn't respond positively to their Mamba mentality or whatever Jimmy Butler spews. I think it can work. I don't think it's as black and white as it's not good. I think there's a time and place. Sometimes you do just kind of have to be an asshole while you're managing people, but all the time is a little extreme. And even if it did technically increase your success by some margin, especially over the course of decades of doing that job, having the negative environment like that all the time just doesn't sound all that worth it to me. Obviously, that's me being a less competitive person than NBA players are. Maybe people are like, yeah, I'll spend 15 years being fucking miserable as long as I leave with some championships. I get how people come to that conclusion, but for me personally, if I'm just gonna hate my day-to-day life because of a belligerent asshole yelling at me all the time, I'm probably not going to be as effective, and I'd probably rather be on a team where the person is nice. I largely agree, but I don't agree in, like, to the point that it's, like, actively a negative, but it can be. It no doubt can be. From Chib Malzahar. Donovan Mitchell should just fucking play point guard. He is high-end shot creator and pick-and-roll handler, and his production always goes up when Garland is out. Garland also mysteriously fell off of a cliff in ability. The thing holding the Cavs back is their offense, so they need to let their offensive superstar off of the leash and give him the ball. I agree. I think that Donovan Mitchell is a good enough playmaker that he could be your lead playmaker. I didn't think that before this season. Before this season, I was like, nah, dude just doesn't have the playmaking chops, has to be a shooting guard. But now I really am not so sure about that. And as it relates to Darius Garland, I feel like he's just redundant a little bit. Like, he's still a great floor spacer, but like, as it relates to how he helps Donovan Mitchell, I feel like I'd rather just have Mitchell dribbling the ball and then having a 3-and-D guy in the shooting guard spot. I think that just makes more sense. And I think it also takes away from Darius Garland because to many extents, Donovan Mitchell is a point guard. He's treated in the offense as though he's a point guard very often, so that kind of takes away from Garland. I just don't think it's a very good duo, personally. We have seen the 2 star guards, offensive guards, small guards duo before, and Dame and CJ. There's other times throughout history that it's happened. If your backcourt features 2 small players who aren't good defenders, that's a problem. Okay, it's just a problem, and I don't think it's one that you can get over, even when you have 2 big men who are phenomenal rim protectors on the floor at the same time, and Isaac Okoro, who's a good perimeter defender. Shout out to him for just getting paid. Doesn't really work, though. Lots of, there's just too many weaknesses in that. From Daniel Lee. Championships and awards don't mean anything when evaluating players of all time. First off, championships and playoff win-loss records are a team accomplishment, so using it to reflect a player's individual ability isn't a very accurate representation, especially since there are a variety of ways to gauge this. Similarly, awards are solely media-driven, and every year the media gives the award to whoever they want. This is especially true for MVPs, which at this point holds zero meaning whatsoever due to the lack of criteria and consistency. Just because Russ, for example, won the MVP in 2017 doesn't make him automatically the best player that year. Similarly, Tim Duncan has 0 DPOYs where guys like Marcus Smart and Tyson Chandler have one, but nobody in their right mind would claim those dudes are the best defender of all time over Duncan. Every year, award voting gets more and more blatantly ridiculous, and yet people still use them to evaluate players. I don't get it. Here's what I will say. This is an argument that gets brought up all the time, like how much should we evaluate championships and awards and where we rank players all time. I don't like any statement that is declarative about that. So sure, like championships and awards don't mean anything when evaluating players all time. That is a ridiculous take. Saying the media has diluted the value of those takes is a little, of those awards is a little bit different, but to say it outright doesn't matter is ludicrous. I feel like the people who are staunchly championship pilled, where they're like, championships all that matter. If you can't do a championship, I don't care. I don't want to rank you high. I'm not going to rank you high all time if you didn't win a championship. Like those types of people, or these people who think that they shouldn't be a factor at all. I think both sides of that spectrum are ridiculous. People just don't like there being gray areas, and unfortunately, if you're jumping into an all-time great discussion, you are jumping into a pool of gray. That's how this works. It's how it's always going to work. There will be no declarative thing that is right or wrong. And like for these awards, I feel like largely they're given to the correct player. More often than not, I think the NBA gets the awards right, and that's in recent history as well. It's okay if you don't value them to the degree that other people do, but if you just outright don't value them, I don't understand how you even do all-time debates, because these accolades are a good reflection of what their talent is. Like, Michael Jordan and LeBron James are the two most talented players who have ever played basketball as far as I am concerned. They also have incredibly stacked trophy cases because their ridiculous talent led to that. I don't think there's a lot of examples of guys who would be top 10 all time, but the NBA didn't give them awards that they deserved. From my point of view, that doesn't happen all that often. And I feel like a lot of the people who say that shit, have a player that they're mad doesn't get ranked higher or whatever. Just not, I just think it's a waste. I think it's dumb. It's always going to be a gray area, I'm sorry. From Big Bucket, hot take, Tim Duncan is not underrated. In fact, he is beginning to become slightly overrated, or maybe the better word to use is under-examined. Though it's true that his best moments, such as the 2003 finals, don't get talked about a whole lot, he has the luxury of his worst moments also never being brought up. The amount of times he was up 2-0, 2-1, or 3-2 in a playoff series and lost, the amount of fourth quarter playoff leads he blew, losing to an 8 seed as a 1 seed in 2011 never gets discussed, yet he continues to hide under the guise of being this heavily underappreciated player because people just pull up his page on Basketball Reference and gawk at his accolade count. This leads into another hot take I have, that being underrated has a lot of perks to it, but I've typed enough already. I agree. First of all, 2011, I don't think Tim Duncan was a superstar anymore. Blowing a 2-0 lead, I don't think doing that once or twice is a huge deal. And then 2-1 and 3-2 doesn't mean a whole lot to me. Also, ironically, this is coming right after the take about accolades. The way you are talking about this, he blew that lead or he lost that series, especially in what are the 2011 Spurs averaging? Tony Parker and Manu Ginobili were both averaging 17. Tim Duncan was averaging 13 points per game, 9 rebounds and 2 blocks. He wasn't doing he wasn't at that level anymore. How old is he? 34? Yeah. I kind of get where you're coming from. I have felt, to an extent, I've seen some people overrate Tim Duncan's talent. I think the fact his efficiency was basically league average, despite the fact that he was a big man, does not get brought up enough. He has almost the same, I believe, true shooting percentage for his career that Kobe does. And Kobe took a much more volume of difficult shots. His mid-range jumper percentages are not all that good, despite the fact that he shot them a good amount. That was largely due to his era. That was largely due to earlier in his career, the Spurs having no offensive game plan besides give Tim Duncan the ball. But I don't know. The 2003 run, if you want to say they're overvaluing his peak, sure. His peak wasn't actually as long as I'm sure some people feel like it is. But I don't really feel like Tim Duncan was a superstar post 2008, 2009. 2009, he stops being in the ballpark of 20 point per game score. Highest he gets in MVP voting is 7th. But in 2007, he was 4th in MVP voting. They won the title that year rather handedly. So from this stretch onward, this peak, 22 point per game score, 2.5 blocks, 12 rebounds, 3 assists. Decent field goal percentage. Not great though. The advanced stats definitely could be better, no doubt. Let's look at this true shooting. That true shooting is 55% for his peak and 55% for his career. True shooting percentage, 55. They have the exact same career true shooting percentage. Yeah, that I think is undermentioned. If there was any criticism I would give towards Tim Duncan that I don't actually hear that often, it's that one. And it's weird because you hear the criticism that Kobe was inefficient all the time. No one ever says that shit about Tim Duncan, and I don't know why. I think it's just because of the reputation of the play style that Kobe takes more difficult shots. Dude scored, when people argue that like Kobe has no case for being over Tim Duncan, this is what I would argue. Like, if you care mostly about like peak stats, peak scoring numbers, especially like going from 2000 to 2013, 28 points per game, 5 assists, and he's doing that on basically the same efficiency that Tim Duncan did in his peak seasons. Yeah, 55.7. So, at large, I don't know. I don't know why that's not brought up more. But I don't actually think that he's overrated. I'm starting to think that he's not actually that underrated anymore. That's where the tides have turned. I think there has been a lot of love shown to Tim Duncan the last couple of years. There's been a lot more of an appreciation of his career after the fact. I'd like to think in some small part I've contributed to that because I talk about him a lot and tried to make a point to talk about him because people like to forget the Spurs and never talk about them. I'm also a staunch defender that his teammates were overrated, and the influence of Greg Popovich is regularly overrated to the point where people say that he outright doesn't really get credit for his titles because he had Greg Popovich. I don't really think he's underrated or overrated anymore. Kind of a blind ramble there, but that's what this channel is. This take I am addressing right now. This is the last one. From Ghostface. Is another Tim Duncan one, but this is important. People only call Tim Duncan a power forward so he can have the greatest power forward of all time title, when in reality he played more years at center than power forward. I don't even think that's technically true. Look at his peak years. Oh wow, look at that. Oh wow, look at that. He plays center the latter half of his career, where he's a considerably worse player and doesn't get like treated like the same player. Like, we're talking about a peak Tim Duncan when we're saying the guy is the greatest power forward ever. Look at his peak years. These are some of the best stats a power forward has ever put up, and his defense is the greatest a power forward's ever had. Now, is it fair to say that in certain closing lineups, because they like wanted to get Manu out there, for example, they would put Tim at the center position? Sure. But the Spurs were so adamant about playing Tim Duncan at the 4 more often than not earlier on in his career that they were just playing complete like 2K generics at the center position. Here is Rasho Netrovic rather, 7-foot center. He actually had a fairly long career. But in San Antonio, he's scoring 8 points, grabbing 6 rebounds. If we go back a year, is it the same guy? Or no, it's probably not. Games started. No, it is the same guy that year. So David Robinson was the starting center for much of Tim Duncan's peak, and then this fucking Rasho Netrovic guy. His peak years, he played power forward. So yeah, he's the greatest power forward of all time. I don't care if he played center when he was 35. Anyways, that's it. Shout out to Nick for editing this video, and goodbye.